Now, almost every day on this show, I talk about the wars that this country is waging abroad. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in supposed secret in Pakistan and Yemen. And I think of the loss of life, the money, the purposelessness of it all. And I get depressed, and I won't stop doing that. But today, I want to focus on a war that's going on right here in America. A war that's being waged by the religious right that I find utterly disgusting, dehumanizing, and plain vile. And to be honest, I'm sorry that I haven't said more about it on a continual basis on this show. It's the war on women and women's reproductive rights, and really their rights to basic health services. And sadly, there are enough examples to prove it that I could probably spend an entire hour of the show talking about them. But here are just a few of the ways that the GOP is waging its war against women. First of all, they've attempted to redefine the term rape, saying that it can only be called rape if it is forced. So basically, if there wasn't any violence involved, then you were asking for it. And even though the outcry against this was immediate, they have still not stopped pushing for this legislation. In Georgia, one lawmaker has proposed a bill that would criminalize some miscarriages, make abortions illegal, and make the punishment for abortions the death penalty. Here in D.C., Congress has their hands on a bill that would let hospitals allow a woman to die rather than perform an abortion to save her life, if they feel so morally inclined to do so. Now, in South Dakota, there was a highly contentious bill put forth by one lawmaker that would redefine justifiable homicide to include killing in the name of, in the defense of, a fetus. In other words, opening up the door for someone to go out and kill abortion doctors. And Congress has just recently voted for all federal funding to be cut from Planned Parenthood. Keep in mind, 97% of what Planned Parenthood does is STD and HIV testing, cervical and breast cancer screenings, providing contraception, education, not just abortions. And on top of all that, Republicans are now pushing to eliminate all funds for the only federal family planning program. But get this. They are considering funding contraception for wild horses. And yeah, you heard me right on that one. Wild horses. So I just have to ask, have we gone completely crazy? Well, joining me from our studio in New York to discuss this is Jill Filipovic, editor of Feminist. Jill, thanks so much for joining us. Now, you know, it's one thing when you have individual states coming up with this really crazy legislation, but then when you have Congress pushing for it federally, things like defunding Planned Parenthood, is there any denial that there is a national war going on against women and their reproductive rights in this country?
No, there's definitely no denying that there is an ongoing war on women. You know, and Planned Parenthood and Title X funding, like you discussed, are really just the tip of the iceberg. This isn't about abortion. Very few of these bills are actually focused on decreasing the abortion rate. This is much more focused on shaming women for having any sort of life outside of, you know, the very traditional gender roles of being a wife and a mother, and creating very real and very harmful disincentives for women to express any sort of normal human sexuality or to have really any normal lives outside of the role that Republicans would like to see them in.
Now, let's talk about what defunding Planned Parenthood would do, right? Planned Parenthood provides contraception, family planning, cancer screenings, HIV, STD tests. So if you get rid of Planned Parenthood, aren't you creating more abortions, more cancer, more HIV? Isn't this a bigger burden on this country's healthcare system, which Republicans, you know, apparently are fighting against because they want to enact budget cuts?
It certainly is. You know, last year, 3 million women visited Planned Parenthood and used their services. Planned Parenthood prescribed contraception for 2.5 million Americans last year. You know, they did hundreds of thousands of cervical cancer screenings, of breast exams, of HIV and STI testing and treatment. Very little of what Planned Parenthood actually does is abortion. And it's also worth noting that federal funding never pays for abortion. So none of these cuts, not a dollar of these cuts, is going to be a cut from abortion services. It's going to be a cut from preventative services, from the very things that prevent abortion in the first place, which I think is worth emphasizing because it really shows that this isn't about preserving life. It's not about ending abortion. You know, it's not about, certainly not about improving the lives of children or women or men. It's just very much about reinstating this idea that women shouldn't be having sex. And if they are having sex, they should only be having it in the confines of a heterosexual marriage, and it should only be to make children. Plenty of married women use contraception too, and this is going to affect them just as much.
But the fact that they're willing to, at the same time, put people in danger of, not being able to have cancer screenings or HIV tests in order to make this point makes me feel like the priorities in this country are just so screwed up. The fact that there's legislation on the books where a hospital can allow a woman to die because they morally don't feel okay with providing her with an abortion, even though they morally, I guess, feel okay with letting her die. But at the same time, they're totally cool with providing contraception to horses. Are we valuing, are we more animal friendly than we are human friendly suddenly?
Well, I think with the horse example, it's an interesting one because, there Republicans looked at a very real problem, which is that horses are animals and they mate and they reproduce and the horse population is out of control. And, they had two options. You can keep those horses pinned in and you can not let them live free lives, or, you can give them contraception. With women, obviously we have, higher cognitive abilities than horses. But Republicans have very much decided they'd rather keep us pinned in than offer us a variety of options that we can choose from in order to pick the best life path. So it's been an instructive few months to see what Republicans prioritize when it comes to women's health as soon as they're given any modicum of power.
But do you think that Americans that perhaps may identify themselves as Republicans, that they necessarily agree with this? I mean, yes, of course, abortion, often these religious issues become very contentious. But at the same time, the hypocrisy of it all, of wanting smaller government and yet wanting the biggest government possible when it comes to what you can do in your bedroom and what's in your medical, what is in your medicine cabinet and how much money from the government goes into your health care, it just doesn't really seem to add up to me.
It doesn't. It's incredibly fiscally irresponsible in the long run to cut services that provide preventative health care and contraception. It is much more expensive to pay for the care of a disease that could have been prevented or caught early than it is to catch that disease early. It's much less expensive to prevent pregnancy in the first place than it is to, support millions of children who were born, unintentionally and maybe end up in the foster care system, and aren't adequately cared for. So this is an incredibly fiscally irresponsible decision to cut Planned Parenthood funding. Also, the vast majority of women in the United States use contraception at some point in their lives. It's somewhere around 90%. So the idea that contraception is somehow a divisive issue in this country, it doesn't exist. But it's worth noting that there isn't, as far as I know, a single mainstream pro-life group that supports contraception access, even though that's the most efficient and proven way to decrease the abortion rate. These very extreme right-wing groups have sort of taken over the Republican agenda. And I think a lot of people that identify as pro-life or identify as Republicans don't even really understand that this isn't about abortion anymore, that it's very much about your access to contraception, that it's about your access to health care generally. And it's well worth getting that message out there and making it clear that the GOP right now isn't interested in preserving life or promoting life. It's interested in punishing women.
Yeah, it's going to hurt people, and I hope that somebody out there notices. But how far do you think that it might go, right? We're 40 years past Roe v. Wade, but now we see this national war going on, legislation in many states. We see Congress acting on it. How bad do you think it could get?
Well, I think this bill in Georgia is an indication of how bad it could get. The bill is essentially the logical conclusion of the pro-life position, which is that if you're a human being from the time sperm hits egg, then anything that happens to that fertilized egg or the zygote or once it's a fetus is potentially murder. So this Georgia bill basically criminalizes miscarriage. It's very clear that the only way that a miscarriage is not prenatal murder is if there was no human involvement whatsoever, and that's the word they use, in inducing this miscarriage. So, what that actually means. If a woman doesn't know she's pregnant and she goes skiing and falls and has a miscarriage, is she a murderer? If a woman eats cold cuts from the deli or doesn't take her prenatal vitamins or doesn't have enough money to get adequate prenatal care and that contributes to her miscarriage, is Georgia really going to investigate that and potentially prosecute her? I mean, that's what this bill makes it sound like. And that's a very, very scary proposition and a very frightening encroachment into women's bodies.
I'm with you there. Definitely sounds like a very scary step, and hopefully one that Georgia won't actually take. Jill, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.